Hello, folks. How's it going? Dr. Santana here. And in this lecture, I'll be covering writing in history, and I'll be going over examples from the two assigned readings, the Harvard College Writing Center Wewers article, A Brief Guide to Writing the History paper. And the other article that we will be referencing here is the Southwestern University Guide for Writing in History by Dr. Melissa Byrnes. And so I'm not going to go over every single point in this reading. I've summarized the essential points that are kind of covered in both of these readings as follows. And so I'll be focusing on these points, which is first of all, remembering to write in the past tense, avoiding vague generalizations, providing necessary context, and also a note on treating your historical subjects with respect, paraphrasing when you can, quoting if you must, and lastly, writing in the formal academic voice. Writing in the past tense. Just to quote the reading here, as it mentions, some students have been taught to enliven their prose by writing in the literary present tense. Such prose, while acceptable in other disciplines, it represents poor historical thinking. Since all historical events since all historical events, including the composition of primary and secondary sources, took place at some point in the past, write about them in the past tense. Academic historians, we write in the past tense. You might encounter works that use the literary present to discuss documents, but you are encouraged to stick to the past tense in your own work to prevent confusion or misuse. While it is true that the Declaration of Independence still quote unquote says the same thing as it did in 1776, historians care more that it said what it said at the time, right? So the Declaration of Independence stated versus states is how you would write that out if you're talking about it. Let's start off by talking about examples of writing that do not fit this past tense model. And so I've highlighted the errors here in these examples from actual classes that I've taught in both the World History 1 and 2 sections. So, for example, in this first one, it says the student uses signs. In May 1830, Andrew Jackson signs the Indian Removal Act. Second example, the French revolutionaries kill people they consider enemies indiscriminately. In the third example, Moses finds himself in front of the Pharaoh and tells him, "Let my people go." And so just take a moment to look at these examples. What words would you replace the highlighted words to fix this problem, to transition them from present tense writing to past tense writing? You can feel free to push pause to think about it. For the first question, you can replace signs. In the first example, you can replace signs with signed. In the second example, you can replace kill with killed, of course, because that's in the past tense. Consider with considered. And in the third example, I just completely replaced that phrase there because it just sounded too informal. So instead, I used approached, which is again in the past tense. And instead of tells, you would replace tells with told. Another important point, provide necessary context and avoid vague generalizations. What do we mean by this? So again, just elaborating here, good historical writing involves active commentary and rigorous engagement with the material. As a historian, you are responsible for interrogating sources, interpreting evidence, and reporting your findings about the interplay of text and context. And so essentially what we're trying to say here is make sure that you're including important details in your writing. Are you including the names of important people, places, names, dates, important concepts? Maybe there's a social movement, right? If you're talking about, let's say, the Protestant Reformation, you're going to want to talk about Martin Luther, right? Who was the leader of the Reformation. Maybe you might want to talk about which nations, right, he impacted. Who were some of the other historical actors who were impacted by the Reformation? How did this? We could talk about other concepts and other religions, right, that sprouted from the Protestant Reformation, the other sects of Christianity, for example. Maybe you want to talk about the source that he is known for, the 95 Theses. And also in terms of dates, right, what year was the Protestant Reformation? And maybe what were other key events that were spurred as a result of the Protestant Reformation. So again, it is important as historians, right? We're the ones who essentially we have to know how to provide detail, right? So you have to learn how to spill the tea. Give me the details.
So we moved to LA. My father gets a job at the Palm restaurant. My Uncle Junior works there.
What are some poor examples of students who have not successfully, right, provided details? I'm providing a few examples from some of my U.S. history courses and world history courses that I've taught in the past. And so, for example, in this first example here, in number one, the student wrote, they used caste to enforce segregation in harsh ways. In this other example, someone wrote, there were laws that took away the lands of Native Americans. Okay, so what kind of details are missing in these responses? You can feel free to push pause on your video to think about it. And also think about, okay, one way to think about it as to why these statements are vague, there's also the question of, do the students answer the question of who, what, where, when, and why in these two examples? Do they give us those sorts of specific details? Well, let's talk about next how we can fix these problematic, vague generalizations. So to answer the question of do they answer the who, what, where, when, why, obviously, right, the response here is no, right? Who exactly is they in the first example? Okay, segregation, what types of segregation were enforced? And in harsh ways, what do we mean by harsh ways? In what ways exactly? And so if you're wondering who the they was in this first one, here we were talking about the folks in ancient and medieval, in medieval India, and we were talking about the establishing of the caste system. And so the fix here, I would suggest, is maybe the Indian caste system. The Indian caste system introduced in the 6th century BCE, because again, it's the when, this is answering the when, created thousands of castes, right? So that answers the what, who were not allowed to marry or interact with others from other castes. Those treated with the most unjustly were the untouchables, who had the most undesirable jobs like corpse removers and trash collectors. So you see, this is a much more detailed, better response. This helps to give us the who, what, where, when, and the why. If you wanted to elaborate further, you would say, why were these caste systems established in the first place, right? And point out that they were meant to enforce social hierarchies. They kept certain families in power. It was a method of division of labor. And now for the second example. So what laws exactly? And so in this class, we were specifically talking about the Dawes Act, which was passed after the U.S. Civil War. That the Dawes Act, right here in the clarified statement, I suggest after the U.S. Civil War, Congress passed the Dawes Act, which dispossessed many Native Americans into the in the reservations for more of their lands. Ooh, I didn't realize I had that really nasty typo. Excuse me. It dispossessed many Native Americans in the reservations from more of their lands. Actually, that was not a typo. Excuse me. I just read that weird. That could be phrased better. Anyways, the Dawes Act turned many of the reservations into private independent farms that were eventually sold to U.S. colonists. Okay, so this is sort of giving us some more context in terms of just saying it took away their lands. Which lands did it take away? It took away the lands that were already in the reservation system. And how did it take away their land, right? It took them out of the reservations and it sold those lands to U.S. colonists. Going back to this point, it is important to avoid vague generalizations. We like specificity, and we don't like it when you use equivocal phrases like once upon a time or people always say that. This is an example of the very first syllabus that I used when I first taught a history course, which was, I always had it in my rubric, right, to avoid cliche, problematic, or generalizing statements. So what are some examples of those kinds of statements that you 100% should avoid? Here I have some of the top cliche phrases and statements that will make your professor's eyes roll. And granted, I'm talking about specifically history professors, but the same will apply in some of your other courses. I'm pretty sure that you'll have professors in other disciplines that err at the sites of these phrases. So using phrases like throughout history, over the course of history, since the beginning of time, everyone knows that it is human nature, history has shown. So why are phrases like these in historical writing problematic? And give you a moment to think about that. Feel free to press pause. But these statements are problematic for multiple reasons. Human nature, we don't believe in human nature in history, right? Because in history, we're always finding examples of humans that engage in acts that are always going contrary to the norm. So again, avoid these problematic phrases because they represent poor historical thinking. Important theme that resonates in both of the readings is they encourage you to treat your historical subject with respect, and I do agree with this sentiment that to aspire to understand rather than judge the past, you have to remember that historical actors were not privy to contemporary values or assumptions that no historical generation, including our own, is perfect. And while I do understand that, right, and I do try to abide by that as much as possible, especially in my own research where I talk about indigenous peoples and Spaniards, and I know that there's been this sort of tendency to demonize the Spaniards, and there's also been this past tendency to sort of make these generalizing statements about indigenous people without questioning some of the biases that the European sources say about the indigenous people. And so that I understand, but I do have a note here that I wrote. I don't always necessarily agree with this point, in particular when we're talking about people who committed human atrocities like enslavement or genocide. And the reason why I don't mind if you're my student and then you're passing judgment on folks who commit acts of enslavement or genocide is because in some contexts, in some historical contexts, we do know of cases where there were people that they were surrounded by that opposed those kinds of acts of violence. And so I think as a perfect example, I think about slavery in the United States during the era of following the American Revolution. There were always abolitionists, right? There was an abolitionist movement, right? That was there, at least even on the surface level. So that means that folks who were enslaving folks and who were in favor of slavery were surrounded by plenty of people who were telling them that it was a morally corrupt institution. And yet, unfortunately, even to this day, there are some people that kind of try to become apologists for slave owners, saying, well, they were people of their time, but there were plenty of other people of their time who opposed the institution. So anyways, that's my sort of 2 cents on that. Another important point here, paraphrase if you can, quote if you must. Many students rely on quotations as a crutch, missing an opportunity to develop their skills of historical analysis. So instead, you should really be quoting sparingly. When you do quote, you should introduce the source and context of every remark for the benefit of an unfamiliar reader. So try to stay away from floating quotes and also make sure that you're quoting sparingly. I would tell you to aim to paraphrase. Okay, and in many of the assignments that I do assign, I do have a quote limit, and I 100% do not allow for the use of block quotes. Most importantly, in all of your writing, regardless if it's for my class or any other class, aim to avoid colloquialisms. And in this case, we're talking about informal language or the use of slang. And so, as mentioned in this point, informalities. In your essays, do not use contractions, avoid colloquialisms or slang, and popular abbreviations or the overuse of the first person pronouns. If you want more detailed insight into how to avoid some of this stuff, have a look at the PowerPoint slides that I uploaded to Canvas. And so some examples, right? These are some actual examples that I included from my classes, right? From students who previously took my world history and US history courses in the past. I had students who wrote things like, it was very bad back then. The desegregation of schools made them feel some kind of way. Okay, Bruno Mars. This is how it went down. Oh gosh, Gen Z, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to bag on you all, but I've had students literally use this. The arrests that happened after the Haymarket Square bombing were sus. I'm like, okay, this isn't the internet, folks. White Southerners who owned slaves feared that someday the tables would turn on them. I mean, and while that is true, again, right, try to avoid this kind of slang. Um, the nativists were full of all this negativity towards immigrants. The Ku Klux Klan didn't know what they were talking about. And although I do agree with you there, use more formal academic language to express that observation. My final tip on informal language, on how to avoid writing in informal language, I should say. So I would say that when you're approaching writing, think about, how would you speak at a professional event or presentation? Um, how would you speak at an academic conference or during a business meeting? That is sort of the tone you want to make sure that you express when you're approaching academic writing. Finally, my very last point is to proofread, proofread, proofread. And some of the basic strategies I have for proofreading your work is to read aloud to yourself, take advantage of free university writing tutors paid for by your fees and tuition. We have the embedded tutors here on campus. There are also the University Writing Center, right, on campus. And you can also download and use services like Grammarly to help you edit your work. But please do not use the AI function that writes the work for you. And It's an act of academic dishonesty. So you can use Grammarly for the editing tools. I'm very disappointed that they started to include an AI feature that writes stuff for you. But again, it's disingenuous. Please do not use. And lastly, use the spell and grammar checker on Word. There's also a read out loud feature on Word that will read the document to you. So that way it can maybe catch any typos or repeated words that maybe you didn't catch on your first initial read through. All right, folks. Well, that is it for now, and I will see you all in the next lecture. See you soon.